Okay, good morning. You're just here in time. I haven't started yet, so I don't have to recap my first minute. My name is Evan Weiner, and let me put this thing in so I can move the slides and all. We're going back 62 years, and I look around this room and I think everybody here was around 62 years ago. So you might remember things like sit-ins at lunch counters, Fidel Castro in his second year at that point as the dictator of Cuba. Here is the U-2 pilot, Francis Powers, who was shot down, causing a big problem between the United States and the USSR. The USSR Red China relationship is on the ropes. Happier times, I guess, with Mao Zedong and Nikita Khrushchev. And there is the presidential race between John Kennedy and this man here, who I actually knew, Richard Nixon. Let me make that perfectly clear. It was a year of independence in Africa. The business of America, see the USA, drive a Chevrolet, General Motors, and also U.S. Steel. And I think more people think of that as the Pittsburgh Steelers logo than U.S. Steel. Elvis comes back. He's out of the Army now. Oh, Cassius Clay wins a gold medal at the Olympics. And these ragtag guys appear for the first time as the Beatles in 1960. Hawaii Five-0, not the TV show, but Hawaii Five-0. Hawaii becomes a state in the United States. But we start with these four guys. They refused service at a Woolworth's counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. They're four African-American college students: Ezell A. Blair Jr., Franklin E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond. And they sit down at a Woolworth's counter. And remember Woolworths? It had a distinct smell, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really had a distinct smell, which probably was all toxic and probably would have killed us if we worked there for about 15 years. But anyway, they're in Greensboro, North Carolina. All they want to do is eat. No, they can't. They're politely refused service. So they said, well, we're politely not leaving. They were refused service. They were told to leave. They remained in their seats. It was passive resistance. It was a peaceful sit down, and they're demanding, hey, let us eat. And it would ignite a youth-led movement to challenge racial inequity throughout the South. It was the first sit-in. And that counter is in the Smithsonian Institute. If you ever want to see it, it's there. It's been preserved. John Lewis's group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was formed at a conference at Shaw University in North Carolina, Raleigh. 126 student delegates, 58 sit-in centers in 12 states, 19 colleges, and some representatives from Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the National Student Association, and the very beginnings of the Students for a Democratic Society. That would be Tom Hayden's group. Okay, that's SNCC. And this guy here is Julian Bond. I started my radio career in high school in 1971. In 1978, I was working I was 21 years old. I was thrown out of kindergarten, which meant that my entire life was sped up by a year. So I graduated college in 1977 and got a job at a 500-watt radio station and also WNEW radio in New York, where I did news. Remember WNEW radio, Make Believe Ballroom, William B. Williams and all. One of the first people of prominence I ever interviewed was this guy, Julian Bond. Rockland Community College, because I was in Rockland County at the time, and then you went to New York. Rockland Community College in Suffern was running a series every week with newsmakers. The first two interviews I ever did with newsmakers were him and Ralph Nader. And here I am, I'm 21, and they trusted me to not screw up and speak to Julian Bond and Ralph Nader. So I did get a chance to talk to Julian Bond about not being seated after he won state senate in Georgia and the civil rights movement. So that is my claim to fame. One of the first real interviews I ever did was with Julian Bond. And there were a whole bunch of people who were involved. Some of the names that you probably heard of: Marion Barry, who went on to be the Washington Mayor, John Lewis, the congressman, was there, and a whole bunch of other people, including Julian Bond, who went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, where Martin Luther King went. Stokely Carmichael, who became the butt or the punchline of jokes on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In later in the decade, he was there as well. Civil Rights Act of 1960, there was a Civil Rights Act. The last major Civil Rights Act was in 1875, and then it was done for a long time. Eisenhower came slowly to the Civil Rights movement. 1957 was catastrophic year. It wasn't a catastrophic year. Well, it might have been to some, but that was the year of the Little Rock Nine and Eisenhower sending in the 101st Airborne Division when the United States declared war on Little Rock, Arkansas over the 9 students going in. Think of that. The United States declared war on the Little Rock School District in the state of Arkansas, 1947. But there was a Civil Rights Act in 1957, which included federal inspection of local registration polls by approved referees. Nothing has changed, right? I mean, you're having all these people in Arizona saying, fake election, we want a do-over, we want a do-over. But there were appointed referees to oversee the southern elections to ensure that African Americans were permitted to vote. And there would be penalties for anyone who obstructed someone's attempt to register to vote or vote. Prosecution for interfering with court orders regarding school segregation. Oh, by the way, how tall do you think Martin Luther King was?
5'5".
About 5'5". About 5'5". But he was a giant. I remember going to the center in Atlanta in 2015. I was also there in 2004. And I was looking at his personal artifacts, and he took like a size 28 pants. He was really, really little. And I had a friend, Shelley Saltman. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Shelley. Put the phone down. See you in 15 years. My friend Shelley, who was beaten up by Evel Knievel, among other things. Anyway, he went to school in Boston, and Martin Luther King was there. He didn't know him. But he told me that he was a really little guy, but he was a giant. He was an absolute giant, even though he was short of stature. He's arrested on October 19, 1960. 52 people, including King, were arrested in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, after refusing to leave their seats at the segregated Rich's department store lunch counters. This was Jim Crow, and there were segregation laws. Negroes were banned from being served at department store lunch counters. There were 16 of them were charged with whatever they were charged with, violating state law or Jim Crow law. And there were 51 together arrested, so 45 of them were dismissed. Dr. King had a problem. He was held on charges that his arrest violated a term of state probation, which he got earlier that year. After he was sentenced to 6 months at hard labor, the presidential candidate, John F. Kennedy, reached out to the King family and helped secure Dr. King's release, which solidified his African American support in 1960. How many of you heard of Ruby Bridges? You've heard of Ruby Bridges.
Yeah, I don't have to think.
Yeah, well, you don't have to think, because I'm going to tell you about her right now.
Okay.
She was 6 years old. She was in New Orleans. And she got death threats. She got taunted. At the age of 6, Ruby Bridges advanced the cause of civil rights in November of 1960 when she became the first African American student to integrate an elementary school in the South in New Orleans. She was 6 years old. She's still around. She walked past crowds who were screaming vicious slurs at her. She spent her first day in the principal office due to the chaos created as angry white parents pulled their kids out of the school. The segregationists pulled their children out of those schools permanently. And it wasn't just Ruby Bridges, it was the entire family. Her father lost his job. Grocery stores refused to sell to her mother Lucille. Her sharecropping grandparents were evicted from the farm they had lived on for a quarter of a century. These people were angry, extremely angry, because a little 6-year-old girl was going to school. And it was worse in school. A woman by the name of Barbara Henry, who is a white Boston native, was the only teacher willing to accept Ruby. And all year long, she had a class of 1. She ate alone, sometimes played with her teacher at recess, but she never missed a day of school. She was reunited with her teacher, Barbara Henry, in the mid-1990s, and they went on tour, discussing what it was like with this. This is Norman Rockwell's picture from 1964, after he was gone from the Saturday Evening Post. He could never have done a picture. And I don't know if you could see it all that well, but the N-word is right here. These are the marshals, the federal marshals, accompanying a 6-year-old to school. Here's stuff that was thrown at her. 6-year-old. And Rockwell, this is the painting, the problem we all live with. Meanwhile, the House on Un-American Activities, Joe McCarthy is long gone. He's dead for 3 years, but his legacy lives on, because in San Francisco, the House on Un-American Activities were looking for all those communists in that liberal city of San Francisco, and they probably figured out they got to be communists all over the place. And if you look at this picture real closely, there's a guy who fell down the steps. There's a guy who fell down the steps. There are people who fall down the steps. Let's talk about how they fell down the steps, because was it a coincidence or not? House on Un-American Activities Committee, still going strong in 1960, even though McCarthy is dead, even though McCarthy was discredited in 1954, but hey, let's continue looking for communists. So they go to San Francisco, May 12th to May 14th, and they're going to investigate alleged communist subversion. They wanted to do that in 1959, but the San Franciscans said, you're not coming. We don't want any part of you. The House on Un-American Activities subpoenaed San Francisco Bay Area journalists, college professors, 110 public school teachers. And then they leaked the names to the local press, and well, you know, the San Francisco Examiner and San Francisco Chronicle at the time, hey, they were only too happy to print the names. But people in San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley got rather upset. And the House on Un-American Activities Committee said, let's get out of here until everything calms down. But they came back in 1960. And they were greeted by hundreds of peaceful protesters, mostly college students, who formed a picket line around San Francisco City Hall. Here's a demonstration. And, you know, you thought this was only going on with Bull Connor in the South? San Francisco. Water cannons, fire hydrants, fire hoses. A police riot squad turned fire hoses on protesters in the rotunda of the San Francisco City Hall, and without warning. Inspired by recent lunch counter sit-ins of the civil rights movement, they sat down and sang, we shall not be moved. Some were washed down the marble staircase. They went down the marble. Others were dragged by their feet, bumping their heads on every step. My business, which is prone to hyperbole, and is, in a lot of ways, is out of touch with what really is going on the streets. I'll give you something about my business today. They don't broadcast. They don't give news for you. They basically give news to satisfy each other. And it wasn't too much different then. Local and national news media called it a riot. Blamed the protesters. In response, 5,000 people turned out on the final day of protest, including a group called SLATE, University of California, Berkeley student group, along with civil rights groups, labor leaders, and they organized the San Francisco protest. It was this protest that would spark the students to demonstrate at Berkeley during the 1960s. How many of you remember all the stuff that went on in Berkeley? And Berkeley was derisively called Berserkly. I don't know if you remember that or not.
What?
Berkeley was called Berserkly.
Berserkly?
As in berserk.
Huh?
As in the word berserk. Crazy.
It's also called a zoo.
It was called the zoo, among other things. Tom Hayden helped organize the Students for Democratic Society in 1962, although it's in his head in 1960, and he conferred with Slade. Hey, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. No more Batista, I'm here. Havana, Cuba, January 1st, 1959. There is Fidel Castro, and he brings his brother, and Che Guevara, who for some reason is a star, right? How about all those Che shirts? How many of the people who wore Che Guevara shirts knew who Che Guevara was?
Very few.
Very few, but he was a good-looking guy, right?
With a cigar or without?
Both. Both. Anyway, so Castro in 1959 establishes a socialist state after he and a bunch of guerrilla fighters, and there weren't that many of them, and less than 100 of them, successfully revolted against Fulgencio Batista. Batista was a bad guy, but it didn't matter if he was a bad guy or not, like Diem in Vietnam, who the United States was supporting in 1960, 59, against communists. If you're anti-communist, you're our friend. So Batista supported the U.S. government, or had been supported by the U.S. government because of his anti-communist stance. He flees the country. He ends up in the United States and goes off to Europe. Castro gradually strengthens relationships with the Soviet Union. So Cuba is a problem. How about that phone, that white phone? Doesn't that look cool? Can you imagine telling kids today, hey, look at that white phone? What's that? What's that? I used to speak up at SUNY Cortland, and I used to eat at a place, a bed and breakfast, that was owned by the Smith Corona typewriting company, Boss. And so it became a bed and bath, and they left typewriters behind. And the typewriters are all over the place, and the kids come in and say, Mommy, Daddy, can you buy us one? That phone. Anyway, Castro nationalized all foreign assets in Cuba, and he hiked taxes on U.S. imports. And he had trade deals with the Soviet Union. And the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, retaliated by slashing the import quota for Cuban sugar, freezing Cuban assets in the United States, imposing a near full trade embargo, and cutting off diplomatic ties with the Castro government. I don't think any of you here have heard of my old buddy, Jose Valdivieso. Have you? Yeah, he was a shortstop with the Washington Senators back in the 50s and 60s, and then he ended up on Channel 47 in New Jersey, so I got to see him a lot. And we're at a function one night and told my wife, ask Jose about Castro. She did, and boy, did she get a diatribe for about 45 minutes an hour, because he never went back. He couldn't see his parents. They seized all of his property and all that. He ended up in New Jersey, and he was on TV on Channel 47.
I think Castro himself liked baseball.
Yeah, okay, let me get that story. Let's get that story out of the way. Valdivieso and I talked about Castro, and I asked him, was Castro a baseball prospect? Because he's somehow glorified as this great baseball player. But if he was a great baseball player, Washington would have signed him, like Valdivieso and Camilo Pascual and Tony Oliva and a whole bunch of others. So I said to Jose one day, I said, what kind of baseball player was Castro? He said, you got to understand one thing. That's what we did in Cuba. Every kid had a glove. Every kid, there were balls all around, and all the kids had bats. And we would play from morning to dusk. So every kid, literally, everybody knew every kid who played, and they knew who was good and who wasn't good. And he said everybody knew Castro wasn't good. He wasn't good at all. But there's this myth that, oh, he could have signed with Washington and our whole history would have been changed. It wasn't going to be changed. He had no ability at all to play baseball. Castro ends American ownership of the AAA Havana International League baseball team called the Sugar Kings. They moved to Jersey City in the middle of the 1960 season, and they played there in 1961. They were known as the Jersey City Jays, and they moved to Jacksonville in 1962. And they were the team was the Cincinnati Reds' top-level minor league affiliate. So after Castro signs this treaty with the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower administration began financing and training a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow the Cuban leader. Castro responded by increasing his program of nationalizing foreign property and companies. Meanwhile, the CIA is recruiting these Cuban exiles because they want to invade Cuba at some point in the future and knock off Fidel Castro. The Cold War. Man, they look happy, don't they? Nikita Khrushchev, they look really happy. You ever see any of those leaders from those days, whether it was Khrushchev or Brezhnev, crack a smile? Big problem. Big Cold War problem. May 1st, Soviet Union shoots down a U-2 plane. May 1st, it's a U-2 reconnaissance jet flying over the Soviet territory. Since June 1956, Eisenhower approved secret overflights of the Soviet territory. And he wanted proof that the Soviet missiles had not gained superiority over the Americans. You probably don't remember the issues of 62 years ago. Probably don't. But one of the issues was the missile gap and how the Soviets were way ahead of the Americans because of the missiles. They had an advantage in missiles. Also, they got into space first in 1957, which actually prompted the Americans to get off their butts and put money into the State Department for more military. Anyway, Eisenhower didn't know that the Soviets had captured the pilot, who was Francis Powers, and that the Soviets knew that it was a spy mission. Eisenhower claims that no, it was just a weather plane. Khrushchev, though, then produced the pilot and showed the American president had lied, and here is the pilot, Francis Gary Powers. May 5th, Khrushchev told the Supreme Soviet of the USSR that an American spy plane had been shot down on May 1st and referred to the flight as an aggressive act by the United States. On May 7th, Khrushchev revealed that the pilot of the plane had parachuted to safety. He was alive and well in Moscow and testified that he took off from Pakistan and he flew over the Soviet Union, and he was going to Norway when he was shot down. Powers also told him that he was working for the CIA. Well, there's supposed to be summit talks between the guy on the left, Eisenhower, and the guy on the right, Nikita Khrushchev. It's about as close as a smile you're going to get from old Nikita, right? May 18th, they're in Paris. They do go to Paris. But Khrushchev says, we're not taking part in the summit talks with the Americans, Brits, and France unless the U.S. government immediately stopped flights over the Soviet territory, apologized for those that had been made already, and punished the people responsible. Well, Eisenhower said, yeah, I'll suspend the flights. And he did for the remainder of his presidency, which would end on January 20th, 1961. Soviets weren't happy. Conference was tabled. Eisenhower's planned trip to Moscow was scrapped. Eisenhower and Khrushchev had publicly indicated their desire for easing the Cold War tensions. In 1958, the Americans sent a hockey team and a track and field team to Moscow, and Moscow, or the Russians, or Soviets in exchange, sent the Bolshoi Ballet and the Moscow Circus. Remember the Moscow? I love the dancing bears and the Moscow. Could you go wrong with the dancing bears watching them on Ed Sullivan? No, they were on Ed Sullivan, the dancing bears and all that. So they did try to do that in 1958. Powers was tried and convicted of espionage, sentenced to 10 years in jail. He was released in 1962 in exchange for the Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. On September 8th, the German Democratic Republic, or Soviet satellite, East Germany, decides that we're going to limit access to East Berlin for West Berliners, which would eventually result in a wall. Well, these two guys, I guess those are as close to smiles as you're going to get from those two guys. Nikita Khrushchev, Mao Zedong. Sinai-Soviet split. They've been coming apart for the last 3 or 4 years by this point. Mao Zedong is questioning the integrity of Soviet communism, and Khrushchev doesn't want to hear Mao Zedong tell him what communism is all about. And Mao Zedong is upset that there is that sort of little bit of daytime. We get the dancing bears, they get a hockey team. Khrushchev lost face with the People's Republic of Communist China, or rather, the People's Republic of China. Stewie Gates, my 9th grade teacher, Spring Valley High School, 1969, 1970, who left an indelible impression on me on a whole bunch of things, always said, it's Communist China, Red China. It's not the People's Republic of China. Yeah, not the People's Republic of China. And Mao couldn't believe that Khrushchev wasn't punishing the United States over the U-2 incident. And that would be the major rift between the two countries, which almost resulted in the Soviets nuking the Chinese in 1969. The rift started in 1958-59. Mao Zedong didn't like that Eisenhower and Khrushchev were talking to one another and criticized the Soviet satellite, Yugoslavia, and its leader, Tito. Khrushchev criticized Albania for signing with Mao. In Bucharest, Romania, at the international meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties in November 1960, Mao and Khrushchev, respectively, attacked the Soviet and Chinese interpretation of Orthodox Marxism and Leninism as the wrong road to world socialism in the USSR and China. Mao said that Khrushchev emphasized consumer goods. Remember, the year before, he had the kitchen fight with Nixon and an American exhibit in Moscow over a color TV. Anyway, Mao said that Khrushchev's emphasis on consumer goods and material plenty would make the Soviets ideologically soft and unrevolutionary. To which Khrushchev replied, if we could promise the people nothing except revolution, they would scratch their heads and say, isn't it better to have good goulash? Is that good goulash?
It's Hungarian or Russian?
I guess it's Russian.
I don't know.
I
I never
guess
heard
so.
about the
I
Russian
guess so.
I heard a Hungarian goulash.
Yeah,
I
Hungarian.
don't know. I
yeah.
guess it is.
Not Russian.
But, you know, he brought up goulash, so, you know.
Okay.
On August 13th, USSR withdraws advisors from China. You spying on us? You spying on us? You spying on us? United Nation. There is a bug inside of the seal. May 26th, the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., unveiled the Great Seal bug before the UN Security Council to counter Soviet denunciations of American U-2 espionage. Now, Soviets had presented a replica of the Great Seal of the United States in 1946 to the U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman. The gift hung in the U.S. Embassy for many years until 1952. During George F. Kennan's ambassadorship, U.S. personnel went looking in that seal and found a listening device embedded in the seal. It was there for 6 years.
Oh, wow.
Nobody looked for it, I guess.
This was outdoor or indoor?
Indoor.
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 Was it
The-
working?
Yeah, I guess it was, because they, you know. Anyway, the Great Seal bug, and we're not talking about the seals in San Francisco Bay. Lodge's unveiling of the Great Seal before the Security Council in 1960 provided proof that the Soviets also spied on the Americans and undercut Soviet resolution before the Security Council denouncing the United States for its U-2 espionage missions. Now, did he bang the shoe? Did Khrushchev bang the shoe? I remember as a kid watching things like that was the week that was on NBC when I was 7 years old, and in other shows about people banging shoes. Now, I was 4 years old in 1960, so people banging shoes would be something a 4-year-old wanted to know, right? Yeah. You imagine doing that in school? Take off your shoe. So, did Nikita Khrushchev bang his shoe or not at the United Nations?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. You say yes.
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 It would be the nature of the Russian.
Yeah.
So,
Well, here's the story. The story from various angles. The United Nations on October 12th, something happened. Something did happen. Yeah, Khrushchev pounded his fist on the table, and according to some reports, removed his shoe and threatens to pound the table with it in protest against the speech critical of Soviet policy in Eastern Europe. The General Assembly President, Frederick Boland of Ireland, broke his gavel, calling the meeting to order. Khrushchev's image becomes one of this. He's a hot-headed buffoon. Hot-headed buffoon banging his shoe. But his granddaughter, Nina, is on TV once in a while now, Nina, talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war. So his granddaughter, Nina, recounts a different story. This is what she said. Khrushchev removed his shoes because he was wearing new tight shoes. When he started pounding the table, his watch fell off. As he was picking it up, he noticed his shoes and used them. John Lungard, who was the Life magazine photographer and editor, was in the General Assembly, and he noted that Khrushchev did not bang his shoes on the desk, but he certainly meant to do so. Did he or didn't he? Yes.
By the way, using the shoe, it's a Muslim
It's a
custom.
custom, yes.
If you want to deny your enemies, we saw it not that close with Saddam Hussein.
Oh,
when
with
they
the shoe
Right.
and
hit
George,
the,
George
with the
George
shoe, they
Bush.
hit his statue.
also, I think when you divorce in Jewish get,
Yes.
they used to the men would throw,
Throw the
the
shoe.
shoe, and
Punish,
they would
yeah.
also.
Excuse me for a second.
Really?
Thank you.
Hello? You ducking and covering? You ducking and covering?
Wow.
That was me. Well, that wasn't me,
Oh.
but that was somebody like me. I was in first grade, and Mrs. Toper, I got thrown out of kindergarten because they couldn't handle me in kindergarten. So they decided, well, we'll put him in first grade and let Mrs. Toper deal with him.
What year?
This is 1961, yes.
You know, there were two things that I always wondered. There
Yeah.
was duck and cover, and there was going into the hall
Yeah,
and staying away from the glass.
Yeah, well,
and
we'll-
it
yeah,
depended
yeah.
on how fast the missile
yeah.
was coming.
Well, yeah, here's the deal with me. It's 1961. Mrs. Toper's about 25 years old. So they kicked me out of kindergarten, put me in first grade. She wrote on my first quarter report card, Evan's trying to take over the class. I'm 5. She's 25. Anyway, so we're doing the duck and cover. And you know, I don't want to go under the desk. I really don't want to go under the desk. So I said, what's the point? I'm 5. What's the point? They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. Get under there. Get under there. So many years later, I was telling that story to
Where
my...
is it?
I don't know where this is, but
At
this
home or?
is... no, well, this is in school. The desks and all.
It's a desk.
Yeah, it's a desk. So, you know, years later, I was talking to my son about it, and talking about my days in school when I was taking over classes of 5-year-olds. And I said I didn't want to do the duck and cover. He said, she explained it to you? I said, no. And he explained it to me. He said, you did the duck and cover under the desk in case there was shrapnel from the blast. You might not, your head may not get injured if you're under the desk like that. Because if you're close to the radiation, you were dead.
Yeah.
But if you were a mile away, there was a chance with iodine and all that other stuff, if you took it real quick, that it would only be shrapnel that was flying. So that's why you duck and cover. Duck and cover, method of personal protection against the effects of a nuclear explosion. Duck and cover is useful at conferring a degree of protection, to personnel situated outside the radius of a nuclear fireball, but still within sufficient range of a nuclear explosion that standing upright and uncovered is likely to cause serious injury or death. Americans were in Vietnam in 1960. Advisors. Nobody really paid all that much attention because they were all enlisted men. These were not draftees who went to Vietnam. And because they were not draftees, not too many people protested. Dwight Eisenhower didn't think Vietnam was a real problem because he had his guy, DM, in Vietnam. He thought the real problem was Laos. And he wanted to make sure that the Laotian government was propped up in some way. And they being the U.S., was in Laos. There was that domino theory. If one of the Southeast Asian countries fall to communists, all of them will. The United States announces that 3,500 soldiers will be sent to Vietnam during 1960. Eisenhower's guy is DM. Corrupt, as corrupt as can be. Roman Catholic, hated the Buddhists. The Buddhists were the majority, hated him. So it goes to, having a coup, or attempted coup, November 12th, actually is par for the course in South Vietnam. But the coup fails. On December 20th, Southern revolutionaries backed by the North Vietnamese Communist Party, Ho Chi Minh, formed the National Liberation Front, known in Saigon and Washington as the Viet Cong. Well, I think we should have a debate. What do you think? Certainly. John Kennedy lived most of his life, young life, about 4 miles from here. Did you know that?
Yeah.
On Pontfield Road in Bronxville. Bobby Kennedy lived here from he was about 4 to 12. JFK about 8, 9 to when he went to college. Ted Kennedy was born in Bronxville. Not exactly pure Bostonians, right? Right? They lived here on Pontfield Road, which is about 4 miles from here. And I got to know Richard Nixon, yes?
Actually, they lived in Scarsdale and they moved to Bronxville.
Yes, they moved to Bronxville.
Yeah.
And Joe Kennedy saved Bronxville from bankruptcy, which is why you got the societies there and why Bronxville became a closed community. But that's another story for another day.
And he was then an anti-Semite.
Well, yes, he was. Member of the America First committee. Anyway, I got to know Nixon in 1985. He does not come back into proper society because of the David Frost interviews. He comes back into proper society because there's a dispute between the Major League Baseball owners and the Major League Baseball umpires. The contract is up. And I'll give you the thumbnails. I won't go into the whole details, but I'll give you the thumbnail sketch. Nixon lived up in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, Park Ridge, New Jersey. And he used to go down, and I babysat the kids in Philadelphia. Trisha, and David. He went down with Pat to babysit the kids on weekends. They lived in Society Hill off the main line in Philadelphia. The guy who was representing the umpires was Richie Phillips, who just passed away very recently ago. And so he lived next door to Julie and David. And the umpires, 1985, umpires and the owners are at loggerheads. They're at an impasse. And so anyway, Richie Phillips calls Peter Ueberroth, the commissioner of baseball, who we affectionately called PU. And so he calls, he says, how about arbitration? He says, what about arbitration? He says, who do you got in mind? He said, Dick Nixon. Dick Nixon, get out of here. How do you know him? Which I just gave you the story. And he arbitrated the baseball umpires dispute, gave the umpires a 40% raise in postseason baseball. And that's where I got to know Dick Nixon. And Dick Nixon would come back into polite, proper political society because of that, not because of the David Frost interviews. And his office was at Foley Square, across the street from the courthouse, and you walked in there, well, there might be an Israeli flag like that, but it was filled with pictures and flags, and it was a miniature Oval Office there, and we sat in the seat waiting for him. Another crook, another crook, another crook. Anyway, the Democratic field for the 1960 presidential election included the senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, the governor of California, Pat Brown, the United States senator from Missouri, Stuart Symington, the United States senator from Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, former governor Adlai Stevenson of Illinois, who lost in '52 and '56, the United States senator from Oregon, Wayne Morrison, the United States senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. JFK would prevail and would choose Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. 1959, the Republican side, the vice presidential candidate Richard Nixon thought he might face a challenge for the Republican nomination with good old Nelson Rockefeller. I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad you asked that. I'll have him look at it and we'll get back to you. That was Nelson Rockefeller, and he was the leader of the moderate liberal wing of the Republican Party. But there's a national tour, and the great majority of Republicans favored Dick Nixon. The Cold War, communism, civil rights movement, space, closing the missile gap between the USSR and the US are the issues. And also Kennedy being Catholic. Now, here's the question about Kennedy being Catholic. Who's his loyalty to? The United States or the wishes of the Pope? Al Smith went through that in 1928. Age and experience. Both men, they were born in the 20th century. They were young. Nixon had been vice president since 1953, and Nixon and JFK came to Washington in 1947 as congressmen. Both of them were in World War II. And this is the debate that changes presidential politics. There were 4 debates that year. But only one of them really mattered. And it didn't matter because of policy, it mattered because of appearance. In fact, I just did a talk, the early days of TV, and a woman was telling me that one of the 4 debates, her father was one of the moderators. But anyway, take a look at this picture.
Who was the moderator there?
Howard K. Smith is the moderator there, Howard K. Smith. So take a look at this picture. Look at John Kennedy. Black and white TVs. The suit matches the backdrop. Nixon, the suit doesn't match the backdrop. But that should be fine because Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, ran the studio. And you look at JFK, he looks cool, calm, and collected. His hair is in place. The suit. He could stand up straight. Nixon couldn't stand up straight. And I'll get into that in 1 minute. Nixon looks like a guy who just got off the IRT. Yeah. July 23rd. It's hot in New York. It's 95 degrees on the street. He's in the subway, and the subway car isn't air conditioned. It's got to be 125 degrees in there, filled with humidity, and he needs a shave. And he can't stand up straight because he injured his leg on the campaign trail, hurt his knee. In fact, to the point where both candidates suspended their campaigns for a couple of days while Nixon recuperated. And he looks totally disheveled, right? He looks totally disheveled. Whereas Kennedy looks magnificent, right? And I've, over the years, asked women, did you vote for Kennedy because of the way he looked? And you know what they said? Yes. Yes.
What's the difference in age between the 2 of them?
I think Nixon was about 3 years older. Not 3 or 4 years older. But if you look at Kennedy, everything is perfect. Look at Nixon, he looks like a train wreck. That is more important than the substance. In college, I majored in communications. And my teacher was a guy by the name, who really helped me out a lot, was a guy by the name of James McCarthy, who I wrote a book and dedicated the book to him because he really helped me an awful lot with my speech pattern. I went to school locally in New Jersey, And he was the speech doctor on Broadway. You know, you needed an accent fixed, he fixed it for you. Like Paul Michael Glazier, who was, I guess he was Starsky or was he Hutch on the show, but that was his most famous student. And, but anyway, so he arranged for me to go to a local library, and back in 1976 when this happened, it was not easy to get a copy of the debate. It's not like YouTube is there. And basically he told the local library, there, Mawa Library, look, I'm putting him in here, I just need a room. I need it for 4 hours. And basically what he had me do is watch the debate and listen to the debate. Tale of two debates here. If you watched the debate, you couldn't keep your eye off Kennedy. He knew exactly how to act. If you listen to the debate, Richard Nixon outpointed Kennedy in terms of talking. I never watch debates. I never watch them. And in fact, the debates today are actually a joke, since the Women's League of Voters got out of the debates in 1988 because they couldn't control the Democratic and Republican national committees. We want this, this, and this. And they said, go do it yourself. And so, you know, they're just infomercials basically now. Anyway, Kennedy arrives in Chicago for the debate, well-tanned, well-rested, while Nixon's recovering from a knee injury that he suffered in North Carolina. JFK is, hey, camera? He loved the camera. He loved the camera. While Nixon was nervous, he sweated under the hot lights, had a 5 o'clock shadow, and like I say, looked like he just got off a train. Oh, the suit matched the backdrop at the WBBM studios in Chicago. This would change entirely politics. It became more form than substance. Does he look presidential? You might have remembered that from the Gore-Bush debates in 2000. Does he look presidential? Because my business decided that looks were more important than substance. You know, but that's my journalism talk. When I give my journalism talk, I get into that. Radio listeners of the first debate narrowly awarded Nixon a victory, while the larger television audience believed that Kennedy won by a wide margin. Nixon would look better in the next 3 debates. The first Kennedy-Nixon debate would change politics. Television would become a great force because of visuals. 1960 presidential race was highly contested, with JFK winning by a narrow margin. Nixon would concede. But a group of politicians was not happy and decided to contest the race. Group made up of mostly white conservative electors from the South who opposed JFK's liberal policies, especially his support for civil rights for black Americans. Martin Luther King incident. The 1960 and the Electoral College election. And there is Nixon and Kennedy. The Republicans claimed, stop me if you've heard this before, claimed there was voter fraud in 11 states and filed suits in 2 of them, Texas and Illinois, which Kennedy won by fewer than 9,000 votes. And I've been told that Kennedy wired Cook County, his father, while Nixon wired southern Illinois in Illinois. And there was a charge that Kennedy dug up voters from the cemeteries of Chicago. Judged throughout both suits. Nixon took no part in the vote challenges and told a reporter that our country cannot afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. But there was a plan afloat to topple JFK if possible. Sounds reasonably familiar, maybe? Okay, electors from Alabama and Mississippi would not cast their votes for Kennedy, who won both states. Mississippi had 8 electors, while 6 of Alabama's 11 electors were unpledged. The electors lobbied their counterparts in other states to aid and abet the plan. Plan A, the electors from 11 southern states would use their clout to persuade Kennedy to stop U.S. aid to communist countries and to support states' rights, a code for resisting racial integration. Kennedy refused. We have Plan B. Resolution calling for the reversing of the position of the candidates in the election, which would mean Vice President-elect Lyndon Johnson of Texas would be president and Kennedy would be vice president. Or a third option, President Harry Byrd. Ever know about Harry Byrd? He's from Virginia. So Plan C, Republican electors from all 50 states would meet in Chicago. And they would pick a president from a list of outstanding Southern men. Among the choices, Virginia Senator Harry Byrd, segregationist governors Orville Farbus of Arkansas, Russ Barnett of Mississippi, or the Georgia Senator Richard Russell. Byrd would receive 15 electoral votes for president in the 1960 election, as the unpledged electors from Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma casted their votes for him rather than Kennedy. Well, the plan was to cast doubt over Kennedy's victory. Was he legitimate or not? See, things go in cycles, right? Things go in cycles. This happened 62 years ago. Let's cast doubt over the victory. Let's throw mud over it. Create the perception that JFK's presidency had some sort of illegitimacy. The results stood. John Kennedy, the Democrat, 303 electoral college votes. 34,227,096 people voted for him. Richard M. Nixon, the Republican, 219 electoral college votes. 34,107,664 votes. Harry Byrd, who got 15 votes, ended up only with 116,248 votes. But those were the shenanigans in 1960. Independence for 17 African colonies took place in 1960, the beginning of the end of colonialism. Between January and December, 17 sub-Saharan African nations, including 14 former French colonies, except Algeria, gained independence from their former European colonists. At the end of World War II, Africans involved in the pro-independence movements put pressure on colonial powers, reminding them of promises made to secure their support during the war efforts. The colonizing countries, chaperoned by the United States, were obligated to let their colonies go. The winds of change, that is the Prime Minister Macmillan of Britain. Harold Macmillan, the conservative British Prime Minister, delivers a talk to the Parliament of South Africa on February 3rd. The wind of change is blowing through the continent. Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. Macmillan spent a month in Africa visiting a number of British colonies. The speech signaled clearly that the conservative-led UK government had no intention to block the independence of many of these territories, and there is Macmillan. Apartheid, though, is alive and well, absolutely alive and well in South Africa. As a fellow member of the Commonwealth, Macmillan again, it is our earnest desire to give South Africa our support and encouragement, but I hope you won't mind me saying frankly, or my saying frankly, that there are some aspects of your policies which make it impossible for us to do this without being false to our own deep convictions about the political destinies of free men, to which in our own territories we are trying to give effect. Eichmann was captured. A little side story about this. Back in 1982 rather, I was producing a local access show called Jewish Visions, hosted by Rabbi Jack Spivak and a guy by the name of Zev Brenner. And one of the shows was quite interesting. It was one of the guys who captured Adolf Eichmann. The tape was destroyed, the video, which is a shame because it was a great show. But I have an audio recording of it anyway, because as producer I was going through it, saying, we got to edit this, this, and this. So I do have an audio of it. And the guy was fascinating, talking about how they got to Eichmann, how they found Eichmann in Argentina. May 23rd, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion announces that Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann was captured and will stand trial in Israel. Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer, organized Hitler's final solution of the Jewish question in 1942, and he was seized by Israeli agents in Argentina on May 11th, smuggled to Israel 9 days later, 1961, the trial, sentenced to death, and he's hanged on June 1st, 1962. The United States was the world economic power, but that's coming to an end. The phenomenal economic growth after World War II, because there was no competition. We had all the steel, we had this, we had that. The war brought great wealth, and in the post-World War II period, the United States consolidated its position as the richest country in the world, but they were chipped away. Germany's coming back online, Japan's coming back online. The business of the United States included a strong auto industry with a vibrant steel industry. There was no competition after the war. DeSoto Cars, tell them Groucho sent you. Those of you who watched You Bet Your Life, they sponsored. You're laughing at that, right? You remember Fenneman and all that? You Bet Your Life. Tell them Groucho sent you.
The duck will come down.
Yeah. Well, is anybody ready to pay me $100 for money? Which was good money back in those days. That's like worth about $2,500 now. Anyway, so tell them Groucho sent you to DeSoto. The automobile industry was partially responsible as the number of cars produced annually quadrupled between 46 and 55. There was a housing boom stimulated in part by easy, affordable mortgages thanks to the GI Bill for returning servicemen, and that fueled the expansion. There was a rise in spending. The Cold War escalated, and that plays a part. The auto industry dominated by the big three: General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, all based in Detroit, Michigan. A unionized automaker was making a great living. And there was Bethlehem Steel and Wheeling Steel, whole bunch of that going on in which is now some of the poorest counties in the United States. Wheeling, in eastern, it's northern West Virginia, eastern Ohio. The steel industry prospered after World War II. No Germany, no Japan. Between 1948 and 1958, American steel mills employed 700,000 workers. And they were producing steel at a furious pace, making about 40% of the world's steel throughout the 1950s. And Americans were on the move. I don't know how many of you lived in the city and moved out to the suburbs. I did eventually. From the city, Americans are going to look at an exhibit home or a model home. This is where you could live. Fewer workers produced fewer goods, provided more services. By 1956, the majority of people held white-collar jobs. Corporate managers, teachers, salespersons, office employees. Some firms granted a guaranteed annual wage, long-term employment contracts, other benefits. Farmers did face tough times because gains in productivity led to agricultural consolidation. Farming becomes a big business. Family farms couldn't compete and sold it off. Rust Belt firms such as General Motors and U.S. Steel dominated their industries. The Rust Belt was an economic giant at the time. More than half of the U.S. manufacturing jobs were there in 1950. 43% of all jobs were in that area in the 1950s. But the Rust Belt's decline probably started in the 1950s when the GMs of the world had no competition from anywhere, decided we have little incentive to innovate or become more productive. That's when the Japanese decided to plant cars in the United States. Oh, look at that. Oh, why is that man smiling? Richard Nixon. By 1960, the gross national product, which measured all goods and services produced, had topped $500 billion. The United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, but there was a recession in 1960. The good times are coming to an end. Ike's America adds a state, Hawaii, in 1960. Elvis is back in 1960 as well. March 5th, Elvis Presley was honorably discharged from a 2-year stint in the U.S. Army. He remained on reserve service, but wasn't called up again. He had been drafted in 1958. Elvis returned to performing and was on the Frank Sinatra show by May 12th. Sinatra didn't like Elvis, but his daughter did. The Silver Beatles. There they are. Lennon, Harrison, Pete Best, McCartney, and Stu Sutcliffe. The Silver Beatles was one of the early band names before the Beatles. Lennon wanted a name that sounded English. He wanted the Crickets, but Paul McCartney laughing said, I think that was already taken with Buddy Holly. It was Stuart Sutcliffe who suggested that they call themselves the Beatles with an E. The Beatles gave their first performance as the Beatles at the Injure Club in Hamburg. John liked the name, changed it to Beatles, and then to the Beatles because it had the word beat. The Silver Beatles was the name that stayed with them through most of the Hamburg tour. Also, around the same time, another 1960s icon gets world recognition. Cassius Clay. He defeated Zbigniew Pietrkowski from Poland to win the gold medal in the light heavyweight division at the 1960 Rome Olympics on September 5th. One point, there was the thought he wasn't even going to make it. He hated flying at all. He had to be convinced to fly from Louisville to San Francisco for the Olympic trials. He told his longtime trainer that he'd skip the trip and getting on the plane for a long flight. Going to Italy, he was persuaded to go, but he purchased a parachute, strapped it to his back during the flight in case the plane was going to crash. Who's going to rescue him in the ocean? There was Ali in 1985. With me, unfortunately, he was punch drunk by this point. Couldn't even put things together. The Playboy Club. The Playboy Club opens in Chicago in 1960. I dated a Playboy bunny once, which was in 1978 or so. Lori Lagrescio, who told me all about the Playboy Club. Anyway, the Playboy Club, actually, look at the entertainment. Bobby Short, the Professor Irwin Corey, Mabel Mercer, Mae Barnes. But the big attraction was the Playboy bunny waitresses, doling out cigarettes, drinks to guests, and Hugh Hefner was there. Last week I did a talk on 1963 up in Connecticut, and I talked about Gloria Steinem going underground for Show Magazine, A Life of the Playboy Bunny. And there was this woman who was attractive, but I think she had a stroke, and she's in a wheelchair. Afterwards, she's telling me, she says, you know, I was a Playboy bunny once. I said, how'd that happen? She said, well, I was working for American Airlines. We were going on strike. The shop steward said, go get something else for a while. We're going to be out for a while. So she said, I decided I want to be a Playboy bunny. And then she said, the worst part about being a Playboy bunny was walking around in the high heels, holding your drink like that, and having nothing spill. So that was difficult, she said. Hefner would open clubs in the United States and around the world. The Pill. I'm not going to ask you if any of you took the pill. I won't ask you that, unless you want to volunteer that. The Pill makes its debut in 1960 on May 9th in the United States. The introduction of the birth control pill in 1960 could have opened the doors for more women to find employment and further their education. But that education path in the 1960s was very, very narrow, or at least in 1960. Women were generally limited to being teachers, librarians, secretaries, and nurses, or bell telephone operators. You ever hear a male bell telephone operator back in those days? Oh, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Motown. How many of you like Motown? Motown. The company, Motown, was founded by Berry Gordy, incorporated as Motown Record Corporation. The first hit was Money, That's What I Want by Barrett Strong, written by Berry Gordy Jr. and Jamie Bradford. The talent signed, well, stop me if you've never heard these people. The Marvelettes, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells. The Miracles featured Smokey Robinson and Buddy Rogers and Ron White, Pete Moore, and Claudette Robinson. Actually, Berry Gordy had another label that he founded in 1959 called the Talmud label. How many of you did this?
Yeah.
Come on, baby. Sometimes I joke that if you do the twist, you might pull things out of socket for those who originally did the twist back. He's still around, Chubby Checker, and he's not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, even though he introduced the twist. Hank Ballard did the twist originally and became popular on the Baltimore television dance show hosted by the local DJ Buddy Dean, which might have become that movie that had Divine and I forgot the name of it.
Hairspray.
Hairspray, that was it, Hairspray, thank you. Hairspray, which featured my cousin Jerry Stiller.
Really?
Yeah, Jerry Stiller was my cousin, passed away. Anyway, Dean recommended the song to Dick Clark, who's the host of the national ABC show American Bandstand. Song was popular. Clark tried to get Ballard on the show, couldn't get it, so he's running around the South Jersey, Philadelphia area, and he finds this guy, Chubby Checker. His voice is similar to Ballard. The exposure for the song on American Bandstand and then the Dick Clark Saturday night show helped propel the song to the top of the American charts and brought in a new dance craze called the twist. Chubby Checker is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, which was a disappointment for me to go there because it was Jan Wenner's shrine to himself with some rock and roll stuff there from Rolling Stone. Chubby Checker's on the show August 6th. The song becomes an overnight hit. The twist is globally accepted as a dance. White Christmas and the twist are the only two records to have achieved Billboard Hot 100 status 2 separate times. Chubby Checker is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but the song is honored by the Cleveland Shrine. It was the last year of 16 teams in Major League Baseball, which started in 1903, and 58 seasons later, it's the end, because there would be 2 new teams in the American League in 1961, and it's all spurred because the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants left New York. Continental League was formed. New York Senator Kenneth Keaton's on board with the Continental League. National League decided to expand to Houston and New York. The New York Continental League owners took the National League's invitation. That killed the new league, which Branch Rickey put together. The New York Mets franchise was the catalyst in ending that proposed circuit. The American League reacted to the National League by putting a team in Los Angeles and filled the gap in Washington once Calvin Griffith moved his Washington, D.C. team to Bloomington, Minnesota. Football is jolted. That's me, Pete Rozelle, the NFL commissioner in 1986. Somebody said something funny because we're both laughing. Lamar Hunt forms the American Football League in 1959. They start playing in 1960. Pete Rozelle is named the commissioner of the National Football League. In 1960, the league is no longer a mom-and-pop operation. NFL expands into Dallas. CBS throws in $500,000 to help move the Chicago Cardinals franchise to St. Louis. And then there is a 30-minute CBS documentary called The Violent World of Sam Huff. Anybody remember that one? Filmed in Montreal, by the way. Narrated by Walter Cronkite, who at this point is not America's most trusted man. It provided America a close-up at pro football. Well, the legacy of 1960, Kennedy would replace Eisenhower. The Cold War continues through this day. 1960 would usher in a change, including how presidential candidates use television. Vietnam would become a major problem. Castro's influence continued to grow. In 2021, Raul turned the Communist Party over to Miguel Diaz-Canel. Apartheid would become a global issue. And I don't know about a lot of people, because I wasn't one of these, I never stuffed a Playboy in between the mattress, I never did. Not me. Hugh Hefner would influence many growing boys of the 1960s. And that's me with my Secret Service credential in 1980, 23 years old, covering the presidential campaign and covering the Democratic National Convention that year, interviewing Ronald Reagan, interviewing Ted Kennedy. I did that in 1980. And then what happened to me?